So I'm going to be talking also about deep diving, but in particular deep cave diving. So just quickly, why does anybody choose to do deep diving? I get asked that question really a lot, why? And I think for everybody, the reason is probably a little bit different. So for some, it's about scientific exploration, studying deep ecosystems. For some, it might be exploring uncharted cave systems or wrecks. And then for some, it's just about the technical challenges, advancing your skills and your knowledge, and pushing yourself to the limits. So cave diving has really evolved over time. I think it's got a sordid past with a lot of fatalities when cave diving really started. Much like rebreather diving, I guess, a lot of fatalities in the early days of cave diving. But as we've moved forward, cave diving has evolved, technologies have evolved, the protocols and procedures that we use have evolved, and this has allowed us to explore much further into the cave systems and obviously do much deeper cave dives. We also have pretty good training programs in place now for cave diving that are giving divers the necessary skills to safely dive in a cave and push the limits in the cave system. So just some notable cave dives. There's not, of course, all of them, but just to show depth progression in the cave diving environment. So the first ever cave dive was noted to be in 1922. However, this was not on scuba. This was a free diver. And then in 1967 was the first trimix dive done in a cave to 107 meters. This was then in 1979 pushed down to 110 meters. 1981, 145 meters. 1982, 205 meters. 1988, 238 meters. 1989, 264 meters. 1994, 282. And then there was quite a big gap before 2019. 286 meters, and then the most recent dives of 308 meters, and now the record at 312 meters. So what are the things you need to think about when you want to not only dive in a cave environment, but want to do a deep dive in a cave environment? Well, first of all, it's the environmental considerations. So what type of cave are you diving in? You know, is it a straight up and down? Are you going to get depth quite easily? Are there long traverses that you need to do to get to the depth you want to get to? Is it a silty environment? So you really need to take all of those things into consideration to make sure that you can execute the dive safely. And of course, there's training requirements. And I'm not just talking about the certification that says that you can go to that depth, but preparing yourself to be in that environment. Every cave is a little bit different. So have you built up to dive in that cave to that depth? And then physical fitness. I believe that this is really important for deep diving and technical diving in general. The fitter you are, the better your body is going to be able to handle the demands that are placed, that come with depth and deep diving. And then, of course, mental preparedness. Are you mentally prepared for the dive that you're going to do and what you're going to find? The deeper you go, the longer you're going to spend in the water. Are you prepared to spend that amount of time doing deco? Are you prepared for what you're going to find, especially in a cave environment? Are you prepared for any of the mishaps that might come up out of light, you know, dive computer failure, lost line, anything that might happen? So you need to think carefully about all of the things that can potentially go wrong so that you are prepared to deal with them should the eventuality happen. And then, of course, there's logistical challenges. So I think we had some cave presentations earlier that alluded to this. A lot of caves are in relatively remote locations. So you need to think about how you're going to access those caves, how you're going to get into the water, for one. Some of them you can't just walk in. You maybe need to abseil into the water. And then how are you going to get all your equipment down there? That's sometimes an even bigger challenge than getting yourself down there. And then, of course, gas blending and filling. So if you're in a remote location, there's no diving facilities, no little compressor operator or shop that you can go get your cylinder filled. You need to take all of that with you and figure out how you're going to do that. So if we look at Bushman's Cut, for example, it's quite a walk or climb to get from the top where you might put a compressor to the bottom at the water's edge. You really don't want to be walking cylinders up and down there every day. So how are you going to fill your gas? So those are things you need to think about. And then, of course, there's safety considerations. Because the sites are often quite remote, hospitals and medical access is usually quite far away. So again, if we're diving Bushman's Cut, the nearest recompression chamber is about 8 hours away. So if we have a problem, how are we getting a person from there to the recompression chamber? So we need to think about those kind of things. And then, of course, redundancy. So when you're deep cave diving, you need to think about deep diving and cave diving. So you need to have redundancy for both. So in addition to what you would have for a deep dive, extra gas, spare dive computers, etc., you need to think about all the cave redundancy that you might need, so extra lights, etc. And then, of course, we have the risks. So risks with deep diving in general, you've got an increased risk of decompression illness, nitrocnarcosis, oxygen toxicity. As you go deeper, as Nuno's already spoken about, the gas density increases, so you have an increased work of breathing, equipment complexity and risk of failure, gas consumption, thermal stress, limited visibility, and of course HPNS. And if we add this cave diving into this, we have all the risks, as I've just said, that come with cave diving as well. Getting lost, no direct access to the surface, loss of light, loss of line. So when it comes to deep diving, you really need to make sure you've analyzed all the risks. So it's a good idea to have a risk plan in place. So usually when we do sort of deep dives, we'd meet as a team and do a brainstorming session to put down every conceivable risk that we can think of, from the smallest thing to the biggest risk, and then try and mitigate each of those risks. So put plans in place to see what can we do to minimize the impact of that risk. And then it's a good idea still to have an action plan. Even though you've minimized the impact, the likelihood is still probably going to be the same. So have an action plan of what are you going to do if this does actually happen. And of course, there's always going to be the risk that you didn't think of that's going to pop up. Murphy's Law is always there, so likely to happen. And I spoke a little bit about safety, but it's really important, especially with remote locations, and I'm talking about some of the dives that we do, particularly in South Africa, to have an emergency protocol in place. The locations, as I've said, are remote. This is diving at Bushman's Cut. So just getting the diver out of the water is a challenge. It's not, you've got to hike that person up to the nearest vehicle, which is, as you can see, not an easy thing to do, and then still evacuate the person and get them medical attention. So you might want to consider, on-site medical considerations. Can you have a one-man chamber there? Is that going to be useful? Maybe you need to have a doctor or someone that can on-site, administer medications or provide immediate medical emergency assistance should it get to that point. And then you've got to consider the team members that you have, and I'll talk a little bit more about that now. But if a dive goes well, you don't really need a big team. I mean, all your gas is there, you do the dive, you don't really need too many people. They come in and check on you now and again and everything's great. But if the dive doesn't go well, that's where your team becomes important, because you need hands to help injured divers, to carry divers out, to look after the divers that are still in the water. So you need to consider carefully the size of the team. The bigger the team, obviously, the more complex the dive becomes, a lot of people to manage, it becomes logistically challenging, but you need to make sure you've got enough hands that if there is an emergency situation, that people can be effective. So for example, again, I'm going to use diving Bushman's Cut as an example. If something happens to one of the divers in the water, you cannot take one of the backup divers that's just been diving to 60 meters or 100 meters and expect them to now hike all the way to the top carrying someone on a stretcher. You're going to be putting them at risk. So you need to consider carefully how many people you have for an eventual emergency situation. And then, of course, you need to consider the roles of everyone within your team. What are they going to do? Are they backup divers? What depth are they coming to? And what are the expectations? Do they understand the expectations of what they need to do? And of course, what they need to do if there is an emergency situation, and has that been practiced? So just in summary, so deep cave diving is a challenging, yet it is an incredibly rewarding form of technical diving. It does require specialized training and preparation. And the future of cave diving is likely to continue to evolve so that we go deeper and dive more challenging cave environments and push much, much further traverses into caves. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.